In the July of 2010, police in the Shandong city Jinan received a report of human remains being discovered in a disused village well. As they removed the naked body from the narrow hole, none of the officers could have anticipated the bizarre case that would follow. It was a story that included an inept amateur hitman, an indebted chicken farmer, a village affair, and a body being cremated twice. It was the 13th of July 2010, in Sunji, a township about 80 kilometers north of Jinan city center, when local villager Wang Jinqi came across the well, while some of his cattle grazed in an open field. The well looked to have been long forgotten by residents, the manhole covered by overgrown weeds, but thinking he'd found a possible source of water he could use to give his cattle a drink, he took a look inside. It was too dark to see much, so he lowered the bucket down to see if there was any water available. On its way down, the bucket was stopped. Wanting to see what the blockage was, the farmer lit up the hole with his cigarette lighter. It was then he saw what looked like the toes and sole of a human foot. Shocked by the sight, the farmer called the police and the investigation began. As the investigation team removed the corpse from the well, it was apparent the body had been there for some time. The diameter of the well was only 33 centimeters, and the body had become lodged head first. The corpse had been stripped of clothes and there was a significant level of decomposition. There was little soft tissue left on the face, but numerous cracks in the skull and facial bones of the victim pointed to this being a homicide investigation and not just an accident where someone had fallen down the narrow passage and become stuck. With few identifying features remaining, police doctors could only give a basic preliminary description of the victim for identification. The victim was male, a little over 1.8 meters tall, and likely between the ages of 30 and 40, weighing around 90 kilos. Even the time of death was difficult to deduce, medical examiners saying it could have been any time from 3 months to a year ago. With the body giving them little to go on, police somewhat hopefully searched the surrounding area with little expectation of finding anything helpful. The well was located at a junction of 3 villages, but due to a lack of maintenance it had fallen into a state of disrepair, and drifted from the minds of most villagers, so few people even knew it existed. Added to that, there had been heavy rains in the area in the days leading up to the discovery of the body, so if there had been any evidence, it would have been washed away. However, excavation of the well would at the very least give the police a place to start their investigation. An axe was found at the bottom of the hole. It was immediately assumed to be the weapon that caused the death of the victim and had been disposed of along with the body. It had been wiped clean of any fingerprints, and no blood was found on it, but it did have one uncommon feature that attracted attention. The axe had reinforcing metal sheets attached to the handle and axe head, a small detail which stood out to investigators. It was an unusual feature which pointed police in a direction to start their investigation. They visited hardware stores in the area hoping they could find the vendor that sold it. Eventually, they came upon a store that said they had bought 80 of those axes wholesale, and had only sold 13 units. Understandably, the store owner couldn't recall who she'd sold them to, and unfortunately the store had no security monitoring equipment for the police to look through. It did, however, at least help investigators to narrow down the time of death of the mystery victim. The store had begun selling the axes in December 2009. Police were given further assistance in pinning down a time of death from interviews with villagers. One man informed them he had noticed a red patch, which looked like blood on the ground near the well on January 28. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. Blood on the ground wasn't an uncommon sight in villages, where people raised and openly slaughtered livestock for food, especially in times around the Chinese New Year. Police put together a list of people reported missing from December 2009 to after January 28, 2010. They would yield 17 names to investigate. In the meantime, the police forensic team had gotten a DNA profile of the victim. Police could now try and match the profile with family members of the missing people on the list. Taking blood samples from the relatives of the 17 men on the missing persons list across 60 villages brought police no closer to discovering the identity of the body in the well. Investigators were convinced the victim had to be local. The steps taken to hide the body seemed to support that, but had so far come up with nothing. Police stopped focusing on identifying the victim and began looking for potential local suspects instead. With some background checks, one name on the list started to stand out. Chicken farmer Wang Xiyuan had gone missing shortly after the blood near the well had been noticed, and hadn't contacted his family since. He certainly wasn't the victim. The DNA profile from his family didn't match, and he was much shorter than the body, standing at under 1.7 meters, as opposed to 1.8. He was 36 years old, divorced, and local to the area. And while he gave off the image of being a successful business owner, running a battery chicken farm, he was in debt to the tune of 1 million RMB, almost $140,000 today. Asking villagers about the missing chicken farmer, they discovered he had purchased a new car, only 6 months before his disappearance, a red Volkswagen Santana. Police were told that Wang Xian had taken it to a local repairman, shortly after the time the police believed the body was dumped, and abandoned it. When investigators visited the yard of the man who had the car, he told them Wang Xiyuan had come to him towards the end of January and asked that the vehicle be repainted. The mechanic thought it was a strange request. The car was new, and there was no damage to it. He felt a new paint job wasn't needed, but it was a paying job, so he did as asked. Wang Xiyuan never returned for the car, and it had sat in the mechanic's yard for the past 6 months. Police forensically examined the vehicle and would finally get their first real breakthrough. In the trunk of the vehicle there were several dried leaves that had been there since the car was brought in. Some of the leaves had noticeable dark spots on them, which to the investigators looked very much like dried blood. On further inspection of the trunk, more spots of dried blood were found in the spare tire well. The blood found in the car brought up a match with that of the body found in the well. Chicken farmer Wang Xiyuan was now the police's #1 suspect. If he didn't actually commit the crime himself, he was at least involved and likely knew who the guilty party was. Now the investigation team just had to find him. Asking family, friends, business contacts and villagers who knew the man resulted in nothing helpful. His phone records, however, gave the police an avenue of investigation. There were a number of calls made to 2 phones in the provincial-level city of Tianjin, 300 kilometers to the north of Jinan. Contact between Wang Xian and the Tianjin number stopped abruptly in late January, around the time the police believed the body was placed in the well. One of the phones being shut off completely on January 24th. The owners of the phones were 2 men local to Tianjin, Han Baoshan and Han Benli. With some investigation, police found out that both men left Tianjin to do some business in January 2010. Han Baoshan returned shortly after, but Han Benli did not. Furthermore, Han Benli was a little over 1 meter 80 tall and weighed around 90 kilos, fitting the description of the victim in the well. Investigators made their way to Tianjin to talk to family members of Han Benli and take comparison blood samples, and to have a word with Han Baoshan. The 2 men, while sharing the same family name and coming from the same village, were not related by blood but had been good friends for many years. While police waited for DNA test results, they asked Han Baoshan about the whereabouts of his longtime friend over some tea. Nervous, but fighting hard to hide the fact, he told them they left Tianjin to do some work for the chicken farmer, but was a little vague on what that work was. He claimed that his friend then went to another area for a job and they lost contact. He hadn't heard from Han Benli since. The wife of Han Benli contradicted his story, informing police that when she'd asked Han Baoshan where her husband was, he claimed the 2 had spoken recently and that Han Benli was working in another province. When the DNA results came back, they confirmed that the body in the well was that of Han Benli. The police arrested Han Baoshan and began their interrogation to try and get to the bottom of the case and find out how chicken farmer Wang Xian was involved. Han Baoshan confessed that he had ended the life of his good friend but was forced to. When pushed to tell them why, the story he gave was strange to say the least. Sometime in September in 2009, the chicken farmer somehow got into contact with the 2 men and offered them a job. Wang Xiyuan offered them 100,000 RMB, just under $14,000 today, to eliminate a man in his village whom he'd had issues with. Having never come close to seeing that amount of money before in their lives, the men agreed without asking too many questions. They made their way to Jinan and tried to pass themselves off as professional hitmen to their new employer. Their target was to be a man named Zhang Benli, who lived in the same village as the chicken farmer. They were told the reason why Wang Xiyuan wanted the man dead wasn't important, and they didn't much care anyway. They had a big payday coming their way. The 2 men decided that the best course of action was to make the death look like some kind of automobile accident, and got to work. At night they went to their target's home and cut the brake line of his car, believing Zhang Benli would get into a car accident. Their plan failed. Zhang Benli quickly realized there was an issue with his brakes and simply got a mechanic to come fix them. Disappointed that their first plan had failed, the 2 alleged hitmen from Tianjin were undeterred and moved on to their plan B. They constructed a timed homemade bomb and placed it under the target's car. Unfortunately, their timing was off and the device exploded prematurely while Zhang Benling wasn't in the vehicle. The blast doing a decent amount of damage and setting the car alight. With another failed attempt behind them, Wang Xiyuan was beginning to think the pair weren't quite as professional or experienced as they claimed. They assured him it was just bad luck and that the job would be done. However, Wang Xiyuan wasn't convinced and was getting worried that Zhang Benling would realize someone was out to get him. Han Benli and Han Baoshan had been living pretty well during their time in Jinan, and had already spent 40,000 RMB of the advance they'd been paid. The pair were now concerned that if things continued like this, there wouldn't be much left of their payment for the job. They demanded more money from the chicken farmer, now asking for 140,000. If he wasn't willing to pay, they threatened to expose him and his plot to their target. Wang Xiyuan agreed to pay them 140,000, but with a condition attached. He would give them one more chance to get rid of Zhang Benling. He then spoke to each man individually, and told them if they failed this last time, one should end the life of the other. The last man standing would get 100,000 to themselves. The partners in attempted crime dispensed with the idea of making the death look accidental, and decided to just attack Zhang Benling with an axe. They went to the local hardware store and bought the reinforced axe that was found in the well. They followed Zhang Benling, walking one night, keeping at a safe distance, waiting for an opportune moment. However, the distance they were keeping was a little too safe and they ended up losing their target. With yet another embarrassing failure behind them, an argument broke out. Han Baoshan decided he wanted the money. He hacked at the head and face of his longtime friend with the axe, ending the life of Han Benli. He then called Wang Xiyuan to tell him about the situation. The chicken farmer drove to meet the wannabe hitman, and stuffed the dead Han Benli into the trunk of the red Santana. Wang Xiyuan then drove them to the well to get rid of it. They stripped the body naked and dropped the axe down the hole before dumping Han Benli headfirst. Han Baoshan then returned to Tianjin shortly after, telling people that his friend had found a job in another province. As unbelievable as the story was, police at least now had an answer to the mystery of the body in the well, but there was still a significant question mark over the case: the whereabouts of the chicken farmer Wang Xiyuan. Back in Jinan, police started the search for Wang Xiyuan. They spoke with Zhang Benling, who, like everyone else in the village, had heard about the body in the well, and told him the tale of Han Baoshan. Zhang Benling seemed unconcerned about the whole affair, even finding it somewhat humorous. He'd only had suspicions that someone was out to get him, but he had no idea where the man who wanted him dead was, or why they wanted him out of the way. There was seemingly no trace of the chicken farmer. There was no activity from any of his bank accounts, his identity card hadn't been registered at any accommodation, and there was no employment record. His family had received a message from him around the time he vanished, saying that he was running away to avoid paying his debts, but since then nothing. The police came to the only conclusion left, that Wang Xiyuan was also dead. Looking back over the message he sent his family, investigators noticed something unusual. It may have been a small thing, but it was better than nothing. The message addressed the group with the term 兄弟, meaning brothers, and is a term used to refer to male siblings, cousins, friends, or even just people of a like mind. It's a friendly, fairly casual term, and that's what stood out to police. A person would never refer to their father, grandfather, or women as 兄弟. The message supposedly sent by Wang Xiyuan went to a family group chat, which included his parents, grandparents, and other female family members. Police felt it was very unlikely, based on this and other messages he sent, that Wang Xiyuan would have used the term to address the family. This suggested to police that the person who sent the message didn't know who would receive it. Police, believing the chicken farmer was dead, and the message being sent shortly after he disappeared, now had police fairly certain that someone had ended the life of Wang Xiyuan, and the first suspect they looked at was Han Baoshan. After all, Wang Xiyuan was the only person who knew what he'd done to Han Benli. Getting his employer out of the way would keep the hitman's secret safe. Police returned to Tianjin, but the would-be hitman swore he had nothing to do with the disappearance of Wang Xiyuan. Further checking proved he was in Tianjin when the chicken farmer went missing. Disappointed, investigators returned to Jinan and spoke again to the only other person they knew who was involved in the case, Zhang Benling. Again, the police asked if there was any reason he could think of why Wang Xiyuan wanted him dead. Again, he claimed he couldn't think of anything. The two rarely interacted with each other. The officers interviewing him felt more suspicious of that answer this time, but Zhang Benling remained relaxed, even jovial while talking about the entire situation. Towards the end of the interview, he even joked about the chicken farmer and would-be hitman hiding the body in the well, saying they would have been better off burning it, so it would never be found. The apparently light-hearted statement stuck with the police. If there was anyone who wanted to dispose of a body by burning it, then someone who dealt with cremations would be just the person. And as it happened, that was the profession of Zhang Benling. Investigators began to look through the cremation records of the various crematoriums Zhang Benling performed his duties. The last time anyone had seen Wang Xiyuan was on March 9, 2010, so police looked at the cremation records for that time and found there were 5 people cremated. However, all the records were in order, each body had a death certificate, and there seemed to be no issues with any of the paperwork. The suspicions the police had would remain, and they had nothing else to go on, so they went through the paperwork of all cremations he'd been responsible for. In 10 years he'd handled close to 1,000, and at each case all the paperwork and supporting documents were correct. It seemed like they'd hit another dead end in the case. That was until one name stood out on the list of past cremations. A man with the family name Ding was cremated by Zhang Benling in 2008. That same person, according to the paperwork, was cremated again in the March of 2010. The police contacted the family of the man, who confirmed that their relative indeed died and was cremated in 2008. Investigators believe that the person cremated in the March of 2010 was the chicken farmer Wang Xiyuan. Even though the police felt they had finally made a breakthrough in the case, if the second cremation was that of Wang Xiyuan, any physical evidence was long gone. Investigators needed more to confirm their suspicions. Rather than go straight to Zhang Benling, they first spoke to his wife, Zhang Hongxia. They asked her if she could remember anything unusual around that time, or if Wang Xiyuan and her husband ever had any conflicts. She didn't have much to help police, but strangely brought up the fact that some new cushions she'd bought for their sofa went missing around that time. She'd asked her husband what happened to them, but he didn't have an answer. This seemingly irrelevant information stuck out to investigators, and would help police finally put an end to the mystery. The wooden sofa was forensically examined and was found to have blood stains on the posterior of the backrest, which hadn't been cleaned. When tested, it came back as a match to the missing chicken farmer Wang Xiyuan. Zhang Benling was arrested, and when confronted with the evidence, the truth finally began to come out. Wang Xiyuan and Zhang Hongxia had been engaged in an affair for a number of years. The two decided they wanted to be together, and so Zhang Benling had to go. They hired Han Baoshan and Han Benli to get the husband out of the picture. After the death of Han Benli, Zhang Hongxia got scared of being found out. She changed her phone number and left the area to go to Shanghai. Trying to find out where his wife had gone, Zhang Benli got her cell phone records from the service provider and saw hundreds of messages and calls between his wife and Wang Xiyuan. He came to the conclusion that his wife was cheating on him with the chicken farmer. Still, he wanted to know where his wife was, so he contacted the person most likely to know, Wang Xiyuan. He invited Wang Xiyuan to his home for a game of cards. Zhang Benling asked a friend of his, Li Wenxi, to come as well, to act as backup if things turned nasty. The husband confronted the chicken farmer about the affair. Things quickly escalated into a physical confrontation. Zhang Benling and Li Wenxi got the better of the scuffle, and unintentionally beat Wang Xiyuan to death. The two cleaned up the scene and collected as much evidence as they could: the sofa cushions, the stick they used as a weapon, and the body of Wang Xiyuan all went into the incinerator and turned to ashes. Zhang Benling forged the paperwork, then sent the group message to the family. No longer able to contact Wang Xiyuan, Zhang Hongxia returned to Jinan. Her husband told her what had happened, and assured her if she ever told anyone, she would also go into the incinerator. Knowing her husband was serious, she kept her mouth shut over the following months. It was only when police found Han Benli in the well and began the investigation she saw an escape. She knew he hadn't cleaned the back of the sofa properly, and the blood was still there. When being interviewed, she made sure to point the investigators in the right direction. Finally, this bizarre case had come to a conclusion. In the aftermath, Tianjin wannabe hitman Han Baoshan was sentenced to death with a 2-year suspension. His sentence was commuted to life in prison in 2015. Despite pointing police in the right direction, Zhang Hongxia was sentenced to 11 years for her part in hiring Han Baoshan and Han Benli. Li Wenxi, the man who helped Zhang Benling with Wang Xiyuan, received 9 years in prison for his role in the case. Zhang Benling received a life sentence for the homicide of Wang Xiyuan. While normally the courts would hand down the death penalty for crimes such as this, they felt there were extenuating circumstances, and it would be too harsh a sentence. If not for his comment about burning the body, it is likely Zhang Benling would have got away with it. That single remark would help the police bring an end to the most unusual case any of the investigating officers had been involved in over the course of their careers. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like, leaving a comment and subscribing to the channel. And hope to see you again for the next dark tale from the Middle Kingdom.